Here we will examine the gross anatomy of the lungs. The lungs are subdivided into lobes. We see that the right lung has 3 lobes. That is the right superior, the right middle, and the right inferior lobes, while the left lung is smaller due to the position of the heart. And as a result of this, the left lung only has 2 lobes. We have the left superior and the left inferior lobes. So furthermore, each lung is subdivided into much smaller subunits that are called lobules. The lobules are hexagon-shaped segments, and each of these lobules is served by its own bronchiole. We see that the cardiac notch is an indentation that's located in the medial side of the left lung where the heart rests. So recall that the heart, or at least most of the left side of the heart, rests to the left of the midline, and as a result, it takes up some space that makes the left lung a little bit smaller as a result of that. And we see that the left lung has a small notch in it, the cardiac notch, to accommodate the heart. We don't see a cardiac notch in the right lung. So each lung has a small point on the superior surface that's referred to as the apex. So the lungs are roughly cone-shaped structures, and we see that the apex is the superior tip of each lung that is just deep to each of the clavicles. The superficial surfaces of the anterior, lateral, and posterior sides of the lungs are referred to as the costal surfaces because this is where the ribs make contact with each lung and support each lung. And finally, to finish the cone-shaped analogy of the lungs, we see that the base of each lung is the inferior surface of the lung. It is concave, so that is, it is bowed in slightly, and it rests on the diaphragm muscle. 2 other structures that we will examine here are the lung root and the lung hilum. The lung root contains the primary or the main bronchus, as well as the pulmonary arteries and the pulmonary veins that are entering each lung. So the lung root represents all of the vessels and structures that are entering or exiting the lung. The lung hilum refers to the surface of the lung, specifically the medial surface of the lung, where the root or the lung root is going to be entering or exiting each lung. So this diagram shows us a little bit better view of the main bronchus, the pulmonary artery, and the pulmonary vein that composes each of the lung roots. So now that we've examined the basic anatomy of the lungs, we can review the pulmonary circulation for a moment. So recall that the pulmonary circulation is the blood flow that is delivered to the pulmonary capillaries. And this blood that is in the pulmonary capillaries will perform gas exchange with the air that is in the alveoli. We see that the pulmonary arteries, which are colored in blue in this diagram, carry blood away from the heart, and they're delivering blood from that right ventricle to the alveoli through the pulmonary capillaries. So recall that this blood, because it has not yet made its way to the pulmonary capillaries and it hasn't yet picked up oxygen, this blood in the pulmonary arteries remains relatively deoxygenated, or we find is relatively deoxygenated. We see then that gas exchange will occur at the pulmonary capillaries. That is, CO2 will be released from the blood and enter the alveoli of the lungs, whereas oxygen will be picked up from the alveoli and will be loaded onto the hemoglobin in the red blood cells in those pulmonary capillaries. And finally, we see that the pulmonary veins, which are red in this diagram, are carrying blood back to the heart and are delivering blood from the pulmonary capillaries to the left atrium of the heart. We can also examine for a moment bronchial circulation. So bronchial circulation, much like the coronary circulation of the heart, is the blood flow that is being delivered to the bronchi that keeps the bronchi tissue, that is the smooth muscle tissue and the connective tissues, healthy and nourished. So these are not performing gas exchange in order to serve the systemic side of the body. So these blood vessels are serving to only nourish the bronchial tissue and keep it healthy and alive. The bronchial arteries are systemic arteries, that is, they arise from the aorta and they enter the lungs at the hilum. And the Bronchial arteries supply blood to all of the lung tissue, that is the primary, the secondary, and the tertiary bronchi, the bronchioles, and really all of the lung tissue except for the alveoli. And recall that the alveoli are served by those pulmonary capillaries. So now we will take a moment and examine the serous membranes that are around the lungs. The serous membranes are double-layered membranes that are fluid-filled, very similar to the pericardial sac that we saw that surrounds the heart. What functions do the serous membranes have? So we see that they reduce friction between the lungs and the thoracic cavity, and they also assist in the expansion and the recoil of the lungs during breathing, which we're going to explore in a little bit more detail in later parts of this module. So the serous membrane that surrounds each lung is called the pleural membrane. So like all serous membranes, these membranes are double layered because they fold in on themselves and they contain a small space in between the two layers where we find a fluid called serous fluid. The two layers of the pleural membrane are the parietal pleura and the visceral pleura. So the parietal pleura, which is in blue on this diagram here, is the superficial part of the pleural membrane. So it is the part of the pleural membrane that makes contact with the walls of the thoracic cavity, the superior part of the diaphragm muscle, and the superficial surface of the heart. If we follow the parietal pleura around, we see that it folds in on itself and becomes the visceral pleura, which is in green on this diagram here. It is the deep part of the pleural membrane, and this is the part of the membrane that rests on the superficial surface of the lungs. And we find once again that pleural fluid is located in the space between the parietal pleura and the visceral pleura.